Okay, good morning, everyone. Good morning. Thank you to Dan Schneider, and thank you to the incredible event staff at the American Conservative Union for putting on this wonderful event, just one of many, many that they put on throughout the year. Let's give them a quick round of applause. They do a great job. So the title of this particular panel is To Bigotry, No Sanction: The Judicial and Legislative Fight Against Anti-Semitism. My name is Yitz Tendler. One of my roles is that I'm a senior fellow for Israel and Jewish affairs here at the American Conservative Union. And we're here to talk about anti-Semitism. The phrase, to bigotry, no sanction, is how President George Washington in 1790, in a letter that he wrote to the Newport Hebrew congregation in Rhode Island, he wrote them a letter and described the United States of America's attitude towards religious minorities. And he wrote, quote, "For happily the government of the United States, which gives to bigotry no sanction and to persecution no assistance, requires only that they who live under its protection should demean themselves as good citizens." So this attitude is central to the ethos of the United States of America. And more than just an abstract ideal, every single day in legislative and judicial efforts are being made to preserve this vision. So we're honored to have with us today three individuals who each provide a unique angle to educate us and update us on the fight against anti-Semitism. To my right, we have David Schoen, who's a local Atlantan. He's an attorney, civil rights criminal defense attorney. And if his face looks familiar, it's because he's a frequent guest on the Sean Hannity show on Fox on television. Next to him, we have we have Ari Morgenstern, who came in this morning from Alabama. Ari is Senior Director of Policy and Communications with Christians United for Israel. In terms of local connection, he's a graduate both of University of Alabama and University of Georgia. So I hope our panel gets to address where his football allegiance lies. That's really the question of the day. And Joe Sabag over at the end is the Director of Policy and Government Affairs with the Israeli-American Coalition for Action, and Joe flew in this morning from Washington, D.C. To join us. So what we're going to do is ask each of our panelists to share a brief opening remarks, introduce themselves to all of you, and talk a little bit about their work, and then we'll ask them a few questions, and I hope there'll be time for Q&A at the end. So David, take it away.
All right. Good morning. Thank you very much for coming. There are two phenomena I'd like to talk about very briefly in 2 minutes. The first is, I believe, at least in my lifetime, we're seeing an unprecedented degree of anti-Semitism, anti-Israel, anti-Jewish hatred among members of Congress. We have never seen the phenomenon like this hate squad of Tlaib, Omar, and Ocasio-Cortez. And Ocasio-Cortez doesn't get a pass because she's not so open with all of the lines. If you go to one of her rallies, you hear death to Israel, Israeli state shouldn't exist, and so on. This has now become mainstreamed, and they have the leadership intimidated, clearly. We haven't seen that before, in my view. So that's one phenomenon that has to be noticed at all times. A second is this blaming President Trump or the administration for something that the Democrats are doing. By that I mean, we hear this spewing of hatred and anti-Semitism, and then there's an anti-Semitic incident, and Ocasio-Cortez or Tlaib, someone blames the president for that. We saw it also, another phenomenon you might remember, part of this phenomenon is Hillary Clinton's opposition research, paid for, GPS Fusion, etc. And then there becomes a multi-million-dollar investigation against the president for opposition research. So this is something we've got to keep our eye on at all times, I think, the anti-Semitism and this blaming. We've seen everything turn on the head. We see in Congress, Mr. Nadler is going to have an investigation, but he hired for his investigators two people who've written a treatise on why the president committed obstruction of justice. Done deal. So he's already decided the fact before he comes to their conclusion. Let me say this. The anti-Semitism and all of his rhetoric doesn't stop, and the danger doesn't stop with the hate squad. Some of the leading presidential candidates now, Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren for two, have on their staff virulently anti-Israel, anti-Jewish haters. Bernie Sanders has three people, Faiz Shakir, Matthew Duss, and Bailin Sisa, top operatives in his campaign, haters of Israel. Israel shouldn't exist. Elizabeth Warren, Max Berger, co-founder of If Not Now, hater of Israel. Everything is the occupation and so on. Keep your eyes on that. And in this phenomenon of turning things upside down and blaming the president for what the Democrats are doing, I'm waiting to see now, with Elizabeth Warren front and center stage, when the president is going to be blamed for using his Native American heritage to get advantage and for claiming 50 years after the fact that he was fired because he was pregnant. That's, I think, something to keep your eye on now.
As he said, my name is Ari Morgenstern, and I want to thank you all for having me. I'm the Director of Policy and Communications for Christians United for Israel. I'm really glad that we're having this panel here today. I think that this is a vital issue. CUFI, Christians United for Israel, has been incredibly focused, especially as of late, as a result of what we've seen taking place in this country, on ensuring that anti-Semitism in all its forms is combated. And whereas once the anti-Semites didn't hide, they wore white hoods, or they wore armbands, or whatever it might be, today, anti-Semitism attempts to wrap itself in different flags. Maybe it uses the language of social justice, contorts that lexicon to say, I'm not anti-Israel, I'm not anti-Jewish, I'm just anti the Jewish state. Or maybe it tries to wrap itself in the flag of liberty, contorting those principles that we hold dear. Doesn't wear a white hood, wears a white polo shirt, shoots up a synagogue in Poway or in Pittsburgh. CUFI's focus is to shine the light on the anti-Semitism that hides in plain sight on the fringes of this country. And what we aim to do is to ensure that anti-Semitism receives no quarter anywhere, not on campus, where we've seen it rear its ugly head for quite some time, and not in Congress, whether it's from the far right or the far left. Anti-Semitism, as Pastor Hagee says, is sinful. Bigotry is not a conservative or a liberal value. Bigotry is the value of those who seek only to hate, to demonize. And what we have seen across this country in certain corners is this idea that you can boycott the Jewish state but not be an anti-Semite, but be completely okay with the actions of actual human rights violators. And today we have members of Congress who support a boycott of the Jewish state. And I have seen no argument, I have heard no position, no reasonable excuse as to why they would support or advocate a boycott of the Jewish state that holds water. Likewise, on campus, we've seen professors advocate positions that, frankly, are anti-Semitic at their core. We've seen them preach in their classrooms rather than teach. So if we're going to combat anti-Semitism in this country, we have to ensure that whether you're from the right or the left or wherever you come from politically, you understand that certain things are beyond the pale. It is beyond the pale to take a position that holds the Jewish state of Israel to a double standard. It is beyond the pale to teach in a church, as Christians United for Israel dramatically opposes, that somehow the Jewish people have been replaced in replacement theology or supersessionism. Anti-Semitism today, if we are to successfully defeat it, we have to agree that people like Matt Duss have no business in the governance of the United States, because I'll tell y'all something, at the end of the day, and I'm from Alabama, and I've learned the history of the South and the history of this country, and I've seen it with my own eyes, but at the end of the day, the vast and overwhelming majority of Americans, they don't hold hatred or bigotry in their hearts, and any elected official who does, and any elected official who espouses positions such as the boycott of the Jewish state is not representing their constituents, is not representing the American people, and is devoid of an understanding of what it is to hold American values.
Well, good morning, everyone. My name is Joseph Sabag. I'm the executive director of an organization called IAC for Action. In 2015, I had the great honor of helping to draft and resource the passage of a remarkable bill in the state of South Carolina, which was the first of its kind to regulate against commercial boycotts of Israel. Since then, 27 additional states have passed this type of legislation, and in essence, what it does is it regulates against manifestations of anti-Semitism when they come in the form of commercial activity, which certainly is something that can be properly regulated. Georgia, where we are right now, is one of those 28 states that's taken this type of an approach. And so I really came here this morning to strike, I think, a positive note And just point out that while there is this increasing problem of anti-Semitism, it certainly cannot be said that nothing is happening in response. In fact, many great folks like yourselves have taken the time and used their personal resources and energies to make sure that their state governments are taking action, and increasingly that's creating pressure on the federal Congress to likewise follow suit. What do these laws do? These laws basically create a regulation for the part of the state government that the state will not engage in investment or, in the case of Georgia, for example, contracting with parties that engage in commercial boycotts and national origin-based discrimination against Israel. That's great for a variety of reasons. First and foremost, it serves the interests of the states and the state's own free market interests. Why? Because it's not just companies based in Israel that are being attacked by these boycotts. Oftentimes, we see that it's companies based right here in the individual states that tend to do business in Israel, but which they themselves are the actual targets of these boycott campaigns. There are a variety of companies that have faced this. Probably the biggest one relevant here to the state of Georgia is the Coca-Cola Company. So first and foremost, when we pass these laws and we see them up and running and in effect, they're preserving the economic and the employment interests of the states themselves. Secondly, we understand that these boycott efforts are a matter of bigotry and discrimination. And certainly as taxpayers, you wouldn't want to see your taxpayer monies being spent or invested in ways that would contradict the state's own public policy protections from discrimination. Why have your own tax dollars funding things like that? And so that's really a very important point as well in terms of the moral responsibility of state governments and regulators to spend monies wisely. And then on the third level, certainly we understand that trade with Israel really applies to some of the most important economic sectors of trade that the states engage in. We're not talking about low-level things like the export of lima beans. We're talking about cutting-edge economic sectors, health sciences, all kinds of technological developments, pharmaceuticals, water desalinization. If we were to allow trade with Israel, to boycotts of Israel to run their course, we have to realize that it would ultimately be a quality of life issue for everyday people who rely on these technologies. The vast majority of us probably have a cell phone in our pocket that relies on technologies developed in Israel, or take a medication that was somehow engineered or researched in Israel. And so there are many very important aspects to this legislation, and what's been accomplished really amounts to something special that's been referred to as the Iron Dome of Israel's economy. But it's important for us to understand that when we take a stand on these issues and we seek the government to go ahead and provide these protections from anti-Semitism in the commercial context, we're doing something that's very important for the everyday citizens of this country as well. So with that, I think we'll go back to Yitz and open it up to some conversation.
Thank you, Joe.
Sure.
Thank you all. So let me start, pose this question to David, and of course we'd love to hear the others chime in. So David, as an attorney, the American legal system allows for a certain amount of a level of holding actors abroad accountable for terrorist acts committed against American citizens. A very well-known young man from Tennessee, Taylor Force, was a victim of a terror attack in Israel not too long ago, and there are dozens and hundreds, maybe thousands, of American citizens who have been impacted by international terrorism. What can you tell us about the judicial system, the legal system here in the United States, and what we can do?
Right. As with most things of the judicial system, it's not the most efficient engine. Legislation is critically important. We at the Zionist Organization of America lobbied very hard for the Taylor Force Act. But there are some things in the courts we can do. So, for example, under the Anti-Terrorism Act, I served as lead counsel, had the honor to serve as lead counsel in a couple of cases, New York and D.C. One case is called Sokolow, one case called Shatsky. The law allows a victim, American victim of terrorism, to sue in the American courts against the perpetrators of terrorism. In the Shatsky case, for example, it was a bombing. 2 young teenage girls were killed in a pizzeria on a Saturday night. It was committed by the terrorist organization called the PFLP, but it was funded by Arafat and the PLO, and which fundamentally there's no difference, frankly, between one terrorist and another in that crew. The PFLP and all of these other outlaw terrorist organizations sit on the executive council of the Palestinian Authority. So let's not ever make the mistake of considering this Mr. Abbas to be a moderate, or however he's painted different places. Their textbooks are filled with hatred. Murdering Israelis and Americans is their raison d'etre at times. So, for example, in the Sokolow case, I'll give you, one war story. In the Shatsky case. Sokolow, by the way, was a nightmare for other reasons. The jury eventually brought the terrorist to justice, awarded several $100 million, which was trebled to $655 million, was overturned on appeal because they found their lack of jurisdiction, that the PLO didn't really have sufficient contacts and didn't submit to American jurisdiction. Number one, they were wrong. Number two, there's now an act that passed in 2018 called the Anti-Terrorism Clarification Act that requires anyone who's a recipient of American funds to submit to the jurisdiction of the American courts. PLO at this time was taking $400 to $600 million a year and had the audacity to say they shouldn't be subject to jurisdiction. The lawyers who took over in the case missed the boat, though. The Solicitor General dropped the ball and took the position of terrorists in this case and never should have. I have documents in my file from the Shatsky case in which the PLO, through its president, wrote a declaration that they met with Condi Rice, and they've decided to submit to the jurisdiction of American courts in all pending Anti-Terrorism Act cases because they wanted to clear their name. It was because they wanted to continue getting money. But in any event, that ball was missed. So personal jurisdiction is something that can be waived. They waived it, and no one ever used that. But in the Shatsky case, for example, this is an illustration. I'll run through it quickly and give you one more story. These folks are just terrorists through and through. In that case, 18-year-old bomber indoctrinated by the PLO and the PFLP was set up with a bomb, went into a pizzeria, stood there in front of everyone, blew it up, and killed these two young girls and other people. During the course of I went over to Israel to take depositions. So I was taking depositions of terrorists every single day. They would have their PLO lawyers sit there and make sure the terrorists didn't say something that would hurt them. And they had a group of 6 lawyers from America. I was by myself against them. In this case, one day we came in. They had never turned over any documents they should have turned over in discovery. Finally, they turned over 18 documents. Well, when I asked for the originals because we couldn't read them, there were 19 there. The 19th document was like gold. I immediately emailed them around the world to different offices and so on and began the deposition. Make a long story short. I got to the 19th document and I was deposing a security officer who happened to be the one honest guy, and it was the one day the PLO lawyer didn't show up, but the 6 lawyers from America were there. This document I knew from the translators, they had turned over the night before, described the murder, how it happened, how it was funded, everything that put the PLO right into it. So before I examined him, I said to the other lawyer, originally you gave us 18 documents, but today in the originals there were 19. I want to show you the 19th document before I examine the witness. His face dropped. They tried to grab the document away from me. I had another copy. He said, well, this is a privileged document. I said, why is it privileged? He said, because it's the notes from our investigator. This man you're deposing is our investigator. These are his notes and they're privileged. I said, I don't think so. My expert sitting next to me tells me that these look just like documents from the PLO security services. That's what I think they were. So I think you inadvertently turned them over, but you should have turned them over 6 months ago in discovery. Anyway, this genius decided he was going to examine the witness and prove it was privileged. So he first asked him whether he recognized the document. He said he didn't. Well, these are supposed to be his notes. You would have stopped with your questions there. He didn't. He said, well, can you identify what the document is? He said, it looks like a document from the security services that describes the bombing in this case and the murder. You would have stopped there, but he didn't. So I ended up examining the guy for about 4 hours on this document. They then moved to seal the document about 4 weeks later, saying it was actually another investigator's private documents. Judge threatened me with contempt. There's an article in the New York Daily News, one of these judges is going to hold me in contempt because he ordered me to either destroy the document or return it to the PLO. I said I can't do either. I would be committing a federal crime, in my view. It would be the destruction of evidence of the murder of an American citizen. Finally, the PLO yielded, and we were able to file the document under seal. But this is they fund terrorism. Look, you know now, they were given a choice. Either stop paying terrorism for terrorism or don't get any more money. They chose to continue paying the terrorists. We did an expose during that case of the woman running the office that's the pay-for-slay office. Her husband was one of the arch-terrorists in the Middle East who was killed by Israeli agents, fortunately, years earlier. This is a campaign. This is going on every day. So they're not our friends. They're not moderates. And when we talk about, the occupation and they have rights and so on, the political leaders running the PLO and the PA are terrorists the same as every outlawed terrorist organization there is, nothing less.
Thank you, David. So, Ari, question for you. You represent Christians United for Israel, which I believe has 7 million members, roughly. What can you tell us about the Christian Zionist movement here in the United States, the history, and also their effect on legislation and their elected officials and allies in Congress and beyond?
Sure, thank you for the question. So as Yitz mentioned, Christians United for Israel represents 7 million members across the country as of today. And we have continuously grown exponentially, frankly. And we continue to grow faster and faster each and every day. And I hope each and every one of you, although CPAC may not be thrilled with it, but I hope each and every one of you will consider joining our organization. Christians United for Israel started in 2006 when Pastor Hagee, our founder and chairman, brought together 400 leading Christian evangelicals to San Antonio, to his church, and he set out a vision. He said, I'd like the Christian Zionists across this country to join together and speak and act with one voice. And there's going to be just a few rules. We're not going to proselytize. We're not going to evangelize. That's not the goal of the organization. We're going to stand with the decisions of the democratically elected government of Israel, and we're going to be bipartisan. And Pastor Hagee wasn't sure how many of the 400 would stand up and support that vision, and every single one of them did. And since then, we've grown to be over 7 million members. In terms of what it is that we do and how we affect change in this country, first and foremost, CUFI is an educational organization. We seek to educate Christians who are theologically predisposed to supporting Israel as to why they have a biblical mandate to do so, why they have an historical, if you will, mandate to do so, why it's simply the right thing to do. And then we turn that into effective advocacy. The Taylor Force Act was mentioned just a few minutes ago. One of the most moving experiences I've had in the almost 20 years I've been working in this business was when Stuart Force, Taylor Force's father, came to CUFI at our national summit in Washington, which is held each summer, and thanked us and delivered a very heartfelt message about what we and our partners and allies were able to do in the name of his son. For those of you who don't know, Taylor Force was an American veteran. He was a West Point graduate. He was murdered while visiting Israel on I believe he was an MBA student at Vanderbilt after his time in the military, and he was murdered by a Palestinian terrorist during the stabbing intifada, stabbed on the streets of Tel Aviv. Another bill that was mentioned here is ATCA, the Anti-Terrorism Clarification Act, and we might have a mutual friend in a guy named Kent Yalowitz who handled the Sokolow case. So CUFI was working and has worked with Kent to try to ensure that Americans have the ability to sue the terrorists who kill and maim our children. Seems like a simple concept, but I assure you it has not been, because of what the Second Circuit Court of Appeals did in declaring that the U.S. didn't have jurisdiction over the PLO in that case. So CUFI worked, in this case, a bit quietly, a little bit behind the scenes, to try to advance and successfully advance the Anti-Terrorism Clarification Act. Some of the other issues we've been working on. Since day one of CUFI's existence, we have held the position that Jerusalem is the undivided capital of the State of Israel. And thanks to the President of the United States, that reality has now been acknowledged by the U.S. government. That's always been the case. That's been the case since David marched into Jerusalem 3,500 years ago. But now it is the policy of the United States. We advocate for policy positions that strengthen the U.S.-Israel relationship and enhance America's national security interests in the region. We do not care what party you're from or what position of power you hold. If you take a position that endangers Israel, If you take a position like the horrific Iran nuclear deal that endangers Israel, the United States, the West, and every freedom-loving person in the world, we're going to stand up to you. We're going to see to it that that position is undone. And thank God the President of the United States, President Trump, tore up the Iran nuclear deal and has now advanced sanctions against the Islamic Republic of Iran, which, by the way, is the world's leading sponsor of terror. CUFI's goal is to ensure that every Christian in the United States is educated about their biblical mandate to stand with Israel and then puts, as our pastor says so often, feet to their prayers, goes to Washington, goes to their district meetings with their members of Congress, and ensures that in every congressional district, in every state in the Union, the member of Congress knows that their constituents stand with Israel. Again, a simple concept, but members of Congress go to Washington, as I said earlier, they go there to be our voice. Well, how are they going to know what to do, what to say, what to vote in support of if they don't hear from us? I'm extremely grateful to y'all for being in this room because this means that you care enough about these issues to take an active role in the legislation and the policies of your country. Well, CUFI does that on one issue, and that is in support of Israel. And that is really the reason the organization exists.
Thank you. Thank you, Joe. Thank you. Thank you, Ari. So, Joe, you work extensively with Representative Alan Clemens of South Carolina.
Yes.
Who I believe is in Egypt right now.
I just saw on Twitter he is with President El-Sisi.
Okay. Yeah. There you go, doing important work. So Alan Clemens, in partnership with yourself, has really taken the lead on writing legislation that other states have adopted, leading the charge legislatively against anti-Semitism as manifested in boycotts that are targeting specifically the Jewish state. Tell us more about what other states are on board, where room remains for work, and what can we do to move the ball forward.
Well, I think the fact that we've seen 28 states take such a strong stand is very much a testament to the advocacy of Christians. We understand, Jewish Americans live in, a select number of states around the country, primarily where they have a presence and significant political influence. And if you're going to get something passed in 28 states in just a 4-year time span, it's really because a whole lot of Christians have come to the table and now have taken an active seat as stakeholders in Israel's well-being. So I think that very much speaks to the good work that we've done in partnership with Ari and CUFI. So, looking around the country at this point, I think many people view Israel as being very much reflective of American values and American interests, and on that basis, Israel definitely has been given very good treatment in state capitals around the country. I think one of the interesting things that's happened in the last number of years has been the development of what we would call bottoms-up policymaking. It would have been just maybe 12 to 15 years ago suggested that foreign policy generally starts with the president as an Article 2 matter and then runs through the Congress and eventually as a third-level matter the states get their say. But what's really happened in the last decade or so, beginning with Iran divestment efforts and then leading into efforts to regulate against commercial boycotts of Israel, and now increasingly so to step in and deal with anti-Semitic crime and discrimination, is that the states themselves have taken the lead, and you'll see many states gathering together around an initiative, passing these policies, and then these policies end up in Washington, D.C., needing consistent treatment by the Congress. That's certainly what happened, like I said, with Iran divestment. It's where we stand presently right now in regulating against BDS, an issue that's waiting for regulatory treatment by the Congress, and it's ultimately what I think we can expect to see happen in terms of anti-Semitic crime and discrimination. We're very fortunate that in the country there is a very clear-cut point of the spear, a legislator named Alan Clemens in South Carolina who wasn't able to join us. Alan has several key accomplishments as a Christian Zionist. He became the first state legislator in the country to file and pass a bill regulating against BDS. Eventually, he became the author of the Republican platform regarding Israel, which really was the precursor to a lot of the policies that we've seen President Trump carry out. And then in 2018, he became the first legislator to have his state codify an actual definition of anti-Semitism. I think one of the reasons why we see such difficulty in responding to this significant increase in anti-Semitic crime and discrimination is because the issue itself lacks a certain definitional clarity. In the last number of years, you've seen a growing consensus around a particular definition of anti-Semitism that was first embraced by the U.S. State Department and which now has become standardized and known as the IHRA definition, which has since been taken up by approximately 30 additional countries. And I think now, with this consensus around this definition, it's something that the states themselves will move towards. And the hope is that it will provide a significant, clarity to an issue which otherwise has been too easily manipulated. And what do I mean by that? I think David mentioned before, it's too easy for somebody to engage in classic anti-Semitic rhetoric, and then at the same time trying to dismiss this merely as being political opposition to Israel. I think of the famous statement. I think it was Justice Byron White who said, "Well, I know it when I see it." Our problem here is that when it comes time to actually enforce state laws or to conduct investigation as to motivation of persons, whether it's, again, crime or something that would amount to a civil rights action, it's been too easy to play coy on the part of bad actors and to suggest that they're merely politically opposed to Israel. And so this definition itself, I think, probably the first and foremost utility is to provide investigators with the clarity to do away with a lot of the pretense and to really examine the issue of anti-Semitism within the context of other well-known forms of classic anti-Semitic stereotyping and so on. So I think that's really what's coming next. And lastly, I would just raise, the issue of the First Amendment. One of the unfortunate things that's happened, within this conversation about anti-Semitism is that the free speech of people who support Israel oftentimes has been suppressed. In particular, students on campus, pro-Israel students, whether Jewish or Christian, often find themselves subject to fear, intimidation, and harassment. We understand that there was a very significant case that happened in Irvine, California several years ago. We see pro-Israel events being disrupted by bad actors. So on one hand, we understand that the First Amendment rights of people who support Israel are being suppressed. Now, sadly, what's happened on the other side of things is that the anti-Israel community has tried to cast themselves as being the champions of the First Amendment by trying to suggest that laws regulating against BDS or laws that take up a definition of anti-Semitism somehow infringe upon First Amendment rights. Now, that's utter nonsense. Why? Because we understand that these laws don't in any way regulate private conduct. What they regulate is conduct that can properly be addressed by the government. Commercial activity, crime, discrimination in particular. Crime and discrimination are not protected by the First Amendment. And so I think the big challenge for this community outside of the legal policy realm and more on the practical public relations realm is to make it understood that these laws do not infringe upon private conduct. If somebody hates Israel, if somebody wants to go out and call for these boycotts, absolutely they have the ability to do so within their private lives. And so, I think perhaps this is a subject matter that David may want to introduce, explain better with his legal expertise, because the First Amendment really is something that's been used as a pretense in opposition to what we're doing, and frankly, it's a flat-out lie.
Yeah.
I think Ari wanted to.
So I think that there's been a bit of intellectual acrobatics, I think, in this context. See, what these laws do is they say that the state is not going to contract with an entity, a company, that engages in the boycott of Israel. It doesn't prohibit boycotts. You have the right to boycott Israel if you want. You have the right to be a bigot in this country if you want. And what I find to be intellectual acrobatics is that these folks who make the arguments that Joe was just addressing, they say, well, we're protecting the people's rights. They seem to forget that the government is of the people. It's our taxpayer dollars. So how can you deny us the right to decide how our taxpayer dollars are spent and then at the same time pretend like you're defending the rights of the people? It's as if they see some sort of separation between government and people. I don't want the Klan on the side of the road painting the highway. I don't want my taxpayer dollars going to that company. I don't want my taxpayer dollars going to an entity that boycotts Israel. It's my money, and I have every right to decide how my taxpayer dollars are going to be spent. And I find it completely disingenuous to argue that those who are opposing BDS laws are protecting the people. No, they're taking the power out of your hands to decide how your taxpayer dollars are going to be spent in the name of the First Amendment, when there is no prohibition whatsoever on an individual's right to boycott. I find it completely a disingenuous argument, and I think bears mentioning.
So all of these points have been very important, and keep the focus. BDS, we throw the term around, but it's boycott, divestment, sanctions. It's an anti-Israel, anti-Jewish movement. Its founders are at their core anti-Semites, anti-Israel, anti-Jewish. You've heard a lot of very important points here. I can't emphasize enough the accomplishment of getting so many southern states and states without big Jewish populations to understand the importance of anti-BDS legislation. It's a tremendous job these folks are doing in the legislative sphere. For your own educational purposes, the Israeli Ministry of Strategic Affairs just last week put out a major document showing the linkage between anti-Semitism and BDS. Go on their website. It's really worth consulting to see it for yourself. Natan Sharansky, a conscience of the people in Israel, he's reiterated again why BDS violates his 3 Ds rule: demonization, delegitimization, double standards. It's worth reading. It's a short read. What we're also finding now on the flip side of this is another American reason to oppose BDS is that there is a direct link between terrorist funding and BDS. I have a document here, some 20 pages long. I'm serving as liaison between an organization who's been researching this for a number of years now. I'm serving as a liaison with the Justice Department to get them to take action now. We can identify now the terrorist organizations who are funneling money into the BDS movement, where that money is going, and so on. That's a real American issue to be aware of. Some of the other things that were said, though, we talked about here some of the things President Trump has done, Jerusalem, the eternal capital of the Jewish people, etc. I want you to consider for a second, I know you're aware of it, the contrast between this administration and the previous administration on issues like that. We were left at the end of the last administration with UN Resolution 2334 that the Obama administration decided to abstain from. This is a resolution that was as anti-Israel as it gets, just about, and so that the resolution provides, among many other things, if you were to visit the Wailing Wall, that's no longer a part of Israel. Israel has no claim to that sort of thing. What we know now is, by the way, current events, this isn't the first time, apparently, that Vice President Biden has been active in the Ukraine. There is documented evidence now that in 2016, Vice President Biden, as the point man for the administration, lobbied the Ukraine and the Security Council to vote in favor of Resolution 2334. The Ukrainian administration has admitted it. They haven't admitted what the substance of the conversations were yet, but this is additional evidence of how the contrast between the administrations. Secondly, I litigated as an amicus this Jerusalem passport case. Congress passed a law that an American citizen born in Jerusalem would have the right on the passport to have it read Jerusalem, Israel. The State Department refused to enforce that. President Obama went to the Supreme Court. We went there twice on this case. First time we won it, got reversed. Second case, Supreme Court ruled in their favor. This is a guy now who many on the left are accusing President Trump of overstepping executive authority. This was the ultimate executive branch authority case. President Obama took the position that the executive branch has the absolute right to determine things like that, override Congress's legislation, and I'm telling you this, fact, in the United States government's brief in the Zivotofsky Jerusalem passport case, the United States government represented to the Supreme Court in a publicly filed document that the United States has never recognized Israeli sovereignty over any part of Jerusalem. Contrast that statement. I was shocked when I read it. Contrast that statement with what we have now with Jerusalem, the eternal capital of the Jewish people, etc. Couple last things. Ari said earlier, it shouldn't be left or right issues. That's absolutely true. I've represented the National Democratic Party as their trial counsel before. I've represented the ACLU. These are constitutional issues. The Constitution belongs to all of us. We're seeing it turned on its head now. And by the way, I'm skipping a little far afield here. It's not just in these Jewish issues. We're focusing now on the Jewish-Israeli issues, but you know that. I'm going to give you another case. Roger Stone, political activist on the right. His trial now, run by a President Obama-appointed judge, is beyond the pale. There's a gag order in place by the left, by civil libertarians. There's a gag order in place that prohibits Roger Stone, any family member, any volunteer, any supporter, from criticizing the Mueller team, from criticizing the Mueller-Weissman investigation, or anything about the investigation of his case, from posting anything on social media, from reposting anybody else's tweet on social media. That doesn't happen in this country. That shouldn't be a left or right issue, but it's an issue out there because anything goes if it's attacking this administration or its allies. That's where you need to stand up and be heard. Very important points you've heard today. They go beyond just the issues we're talking about. But on these issues, think about it. Everyone's got a stake in fighting against BDS for American reasons.
Thank you. Thank you, David. All very, very enlightening points that were made here. We have very little time left, but we would like to try to entertain a couple questions from the audience. Looks like we have somebody raising their hand here. Do you mind just standing up and asking your question? And go ahead.
So I'll try to make it brief. First of all, thank you all for being here, truly. As somebody who unfortunately has been a victim of anti-Semitism, about a year ago, lost my job over social media, being pro-Israel and Jewish. And I'm a little person, and I'm not in Congress. But as we are all sitting here in Georgia, John Lewis, was one of the co-sponsors of the BDS bill that went before. I would love to hear what you guys have to say on that. And then on top of it, as being a proud Jew, we have so many leftist Jews who are pro-BDS and anti-Israel. And so how do we even combat our own people with this? And thank you for Kufi or Kufi lately. You guys have done such a tremendous amount of work of really enlightening people and really seeing the truth. I hope that as us Jews, we can do the same because I feel, unfortunately, that we're failing a little bit as being outspoken. I know for myself, I was outspoken, lost my job. And so where do you go? And for safety issues. So I would love to hear y'all's thoughts.
Thank you. Good question.
Real quickly, John Lewis is our congressman. I've written him a long letter about this. This is what Joe was talking about. They've turned it on its head. He's trying to make it into a First Amendment issue, and it isn't. But he has this specter of civil rights leader and so on. It's not fair. In terms of danger, you're absolutely right. We at the ZOA, Center for Law and Justice, represent students all the time who are physically and emotionally being threatened and hurt on campus because of their pro-Israel views. It's a very great danger.
So I just want to address the relativity of a point that David made earlier, which is now the fact that many high-level BDS activists have made their way into mainstream political forums. He mentioned earlier the head of Bernie Sanders' campaign, Faith Shakir, who previously was the leader at the ACLU that brought a variety of their test cases against the BDS statutes around the country, Arizona, Arkansas, Texas. And so, not surprisingly, a lot of the talking points that the ACLU developed in opposition to these laws were then rolled over into political contexts. And if you take a look at a lot of the legal arguments that are being made, John Lewis, Kirsten Gillibrand, and others who have tried to raise these First Amendment issues, it's pretty clear that those are talking points that have significant political origins to them and are really being parroted. It's a sign of the times. It's certainly a sign of the extent of partisanship that surrounds not just the Constitution, but certainly other policy-making realms in which we're operating. So there's a good deal of concern there. And then lastly, I would just say as a Jewish American myself, when we talk about Jewish persons who support BDS, there's nothing Jewish about their point of view. There's nothing Jewish about their activities, in supporting BDS. And it's really a shame that they're trying to use their Jewish credential in order to, frankly, I think they're engaging in self-defeat in terms of what we would consider legitimate Jewish American interests to be. So let's just not make the mistake of thinking that Jewish American persons supporting BDS have any kind of a Jewish agenda in and of itself. Well, that's our choice, about how loud we want to raise our voices. I think she just said that, the problem is that those persons are louder in their advocacy. That's a problem that's easily solved. If every one of us cares to take the initiative to go out, to make our voices heard, certainly what we've talked about in passing laws like this in 28 states, that doesn't happen because people haven't raised their voices. There are many practical opportunities at this point for people to get involved on a state-by-state basis. Constantly there's pro-Israel policy being made, and it's simply a matter of connecting motivated persons who want to engage with the process itself. CUFI is certainly one of the biggest and the best. I represent an organization, IAC for Action, that's very, very good at connecting Israeli Americans into those processes. Stand up and make your voice heard. That's the bottom line.
I want to address something that you said about the threat. Oh, we're out of time. I'll be very brief. A dear friend of mine, when she worked for CUFI on campus, and she had students who had rocks thrown at them, students being spat on. These are Christian students standing with Jewish students on campus. What you're talking about is a very, very serious problem. There's a bill right now in Congress, the Anti-Semitism Awareness Act, that basically takes that definition that Joe was speaking about and says if there's an underlying unlawful act of harassment, then the Office of Civil Rights at the Department of Education will offer that definition as guidance to investigate what's taken place. Now, this is a first step. It's a first step. But we have to move forward in efforts to ensure that anti-Semitism is defeated and combated, and you cannot defeat that which you are unwilling to define. So I urge all of you, learn about the Anti-Semitism Awareness Act. If you feel so moved to do so, contact your elected official and ask them to support this bill. It's tied up in the challenges that we now face in Washington and kind of the issues that we have there between the two parties and so forth. But this legislation is vital. It is important. And I believe that the Anti-Semitism Awareness Act is a first step towards dealing with exactly some of what you've been discussing.